Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It has been requested that I address an age-old debate, and one that I believe to be rather simplistic, with regard to what contributes to individual human beings becoming what they are, acting in the way they do, exhibiting the characteristics that they do, and making the choices that they make. This age-old debate is the nature versus nurture argument. One side believes that really a human being's essential characteristics and actions are foreordained at birth. And while the contemporary variant of this position is one of genetic determinism, that somehow a person's future is encoded in his or her genes, this position actually existed a long time before the genetic revolution, a long time before Gregor Mendel even attempted to arrive at the idea of a genetic inheritance, and certainly a long time before Watson and Crick uncovered the structure of the DNA molecule. Indeed, the nature position of this debate was very prevalent during the Middle Ages, and later on during the Industrial Revolution, when the old aristocracy was losing a lot of its prominence in the eyes of the people. The old aristocrats were increasingly being sidelined by the new industrial class, the capitalists who were making pretty much all of the money and transforming Western Europe and the Americas through industrial activity, through the building of factories. All of a sudden, the old aristocrats, who were used to a much more agricultural society, a society where the ownership of land rather than the ownership of other productive capital was the greatest revenue generator, these aristocrats were quite afraid of what the capitalists were doing, and so they made arguments that really a person's virtue and a person's merit arise not out of anything the person does, because clearly the capitalists were more industrious than the old aristocrats. They argued that a person's essential worth arises out of his birth and ancestry, and that a person of good ancestry or good, quote, breeding was automatically a better person than a person who didn't have that kind of ancestry, no matter what that other person did. So this is the nature position. It has been manifested in one way or another for hundreds of years. And certainly during ancient times, during times of hereditary dynastic rule, this position was extremely prevalent in justifying the right of the ruler to oppress his subjects. The nurture position is also quite old. This position argues that essentially a person is what his environment makes him out to be. That is, what a person becomes is ultimately a product of who and what influenced him. If he had good parents, if he had good teachers, if he had a solid, stable upbringing, then he will probably turn out better than someone who had terrible parents and someone who was abused as a child, someone who didn't have access to education or material resources. In some respects, this position is certainly understandable. And there are some manifestations of this position, even, for instance, in the Enlightenment view of tabula rasa, a view that I sympathize with, the idea that at birth an individual's mind is a blank slate, and what is written on that slate, so to speak, is a function of the person's environment. John Locke articulated this idea, and he had his own very interesting educational theories, not the same educational theories to which I would subscribe, but nonetheless quite fascinating ideas in his work. And this view also has certain problems and certain constraints. My support for the idea of tabula rasa is qualified and somewhat more limited than perhaps what its original adherents would have wanted to articulate. In any case, we have the nature position of determinism at birth, and we have the nurture position of a person being determined after birth by his or her environment. And that, of course, raises the question of what's missing here. Obviously, not only is this quite a bit simplistic, but it also leaves out legitimate other possibilities for what could form an individual's character and actions and accomplishments. Note that both the nature position and the nurture position espouse an external determinism, the idea that it is some force outside of the individual's control that ends up making the individual who he is. Now, I disagree with that emphatically. I do not believe that an individual is essentially just the product of forces he cannot determine or control or even, in many cases, discern. So, my essential view of what it is that leads an individual to become what he becomes is the self, or if you would like to put it in these terms, free will or volition. That is to say, an individual within certain constraints, and these constraints are very important, and I will devote a lot of this discussion to them, but within these constraints, an individual can determine his destiny. Now, in terms of genes, and in terms of the characteristics an individual has at birth, it's clear that genes do contribute to something. That is to say, a person's genes determine aspects of his physical appearance. What will his hair color be? What will his eye color be? Genes determine in part how tall a person will be when he reaches full adulthood. So clearly there is some effect from genes. Not only that, clearly there's some effect from genes on the brain. That is, the structure and functioning of the brain is encoded within a person's genotype. The real important question, though, and this, I think, is the crux of whether or not the nature position is correct, is there that much variation within the genotypes of all human beings as to contribute to substantial differences not only in brain function, or what is called intelligence, but in personality, character, moral strength, the ability to make the right choices? And this, I believe, is an untenable position, because genes only present a part of the required components for any kind of outcome. Even with physical characteristics, one can see this. For instance, a person can be born with excellent eyesight, but if, for instance, he is severely malnourished, that eyesight will deteriorate. A person can be born with very strong hair, for instance, but in certain cases of severe malnutrition, hair loss will occur. So it's clear that genes by themselves aren't going to make or break a human being. It's clear, on the other hand, that a person can be born with genetic defects, deleterious mutations, hereditary diseases. For example, Down syndrome is clearly a crippling genetic disease. So, in that case, the genes will have a dramatic effect on what that person's life is like. However, the range of possible standards of living and qualities of life and human functionality within the same set of genes can vary dramatically. So, Let's say you have an individual who is, for instance, autistic, genuinely autistic, not as many individuals today are, I think, frivolously diagnosed as being autistic. There are some individuals for whom autism is crippling. They cannot function at all on any level. There are other individuals whose autism does not interfere with their ability to accomplish tremendous feats, feats of the sort that most human beings would not be able to even approach. There are some autistic mathematical geniuses, for instance, and this one ability of theirs leads them to excel dramatically and leads them to successful and fulfilled lives. So clearly there's a difference. Now, in this discussion, I'll focus primarily on people who don't have genetic diseases or genetic physical defects. Obviously, those are great hindrances. But they would be hindrances in the same way as, for instance, a physical accident that brings about the loss of a limb or brain damage would be. A person who is born with a genetic disease of some sort and a person who suffered brain damage or loss of limb in an accident may be in a very similar position with regard to the physical constraints on them. So it's no major support for the nature position to say that some people have genetic defects and clearly they're not functioning as well as the people who don't. Let's look at the majority of people who do not have sizable genetic defects. Of course, everyone's body is flawed in some way or another. Everyone's body departs from what might be called the norm. I don't even consider that to be a particularly enlightening concept. But for the vast majority of human beings, the differences are pretty small. Just as the differences in height and complexion are within a certain range that doesn't really have much of a bearing on the possible outcomes for that individual. And observation suggests that this is the same for a human being's mental capacity and a human being's personality and ability to make decisions. That is, there may be slight variation due to genes. However, that variation is not enough to make or break a person's future, especially when it comes to making choices. That is such a complex phenomenon that genes alone do not even begin to approach it. Of course, the same can be said about a person's environment. One can conceive, for instance, of a totalitarian regime that brings up its subjects to think in a certain way. Consider the case of Nazi Germany, for instance, where someone who would have been a teenager when Hitler rose to power, and this person would have been inducted into the Hitler Youth and would have had certain propaganda bludgeoned into him. For instance, the Jews are evil oppressors and they try to undermine the German people at every step of the way and they deserve to be exterminated. Hundreds of thousands of young people were put in that position. And let's say that toward the 1940s, this person is in his early 20s and he has a choice. He has been made to work as a concentration camp guard. What is he going to do? Is he going to assist in the murder of the Jews, or is he going to try to make their situation better? Is he going to blindly accept all the propaganda that has been fed to him, or is he going to rebel against it in whatever way he deems feasible? And of course there are many constraints on his decision-making. For instance, he knows that if he rebels too openly, he would just not stand a chance. He would be killed. He knows that he can't end the oppression all by himself. He might be able to help the Jewish prisoners here or there. He might be able to covertly communicate with the resistance. It would still be very risky and dangerous, and he would have to do it outside of his superiors or his fellow guards noticing. So clearly the environment has some very significant constraints in place for that person. And yet, if you ask, in the event that this person chooses to kill the Jews, is he morally culpable? Clearly, the answer is yes. Clearly, the answer is that he could have made a different choice, despite all of this terrible upbringing to which he has been subject. A similar situation arises when there's a serial murderer or a rapist murderer. Very often, these individuals have been defended in court with sob stories of how terrible their childhood was. And it's true that often these people were themselves abused during childhood, and to them it seems normal to have this kind of power relationship where one party is the abuser and the other party is the abused. And for many of them, it's barely conceivable that there could be a situation where the strong do not oppress the weak. Nonetheless, this is not a plausible justification for this person to escape punishment. Because clearly, no matter what horrible things were inflicted on this person during childhood, being a victim does not automatically necessitate that one becomes a perpetrator later on. There have been so many situations in any offender's life where that offender could have made a different choice and rejected the upbringing and rejected the heinous environment to which he was subject. The more general point with regard to this is when faced with a certain environment, an individual always has a choice of how to respond. Does an individual accept that environment and its constraints and its impositions? Or does that individual rebel against that environment and attempt to break free of its constraints and impositions? Or if it's a beneficial environment, and that environment offers the individual certain opportunities, does that individual choose to take advantage of those opportunities? Or does that individual choose to ignore them or perhaps go in a different direction? These aspects of a human being's behavior and personality and accomplishments are not externally determined. The idea of free will or volition has been attacked, especially during the 20th century, from certain schools of thought. And in my view, those schools of thought really try to reduce the human being to a mechanism that is easily understood by an outside observer. That an outside observer can condition in the way that B.F. Skinner conditioned his lab animals to give very predictable responses to predictable stimuli. And in my view, that grossly underestimates the complexity and richness of the human personality and the human ability to respond to situations in creative and unexpected ways. The premises by which I come into this discussion are, one, that human beings are much more responsive and more sophisticated and cleverer than they're often given credit for being. That's not to say that human beings can't at times be appallingly and astoundingly stupid, but very often even their stupidity is a sophisticated phenomenon in the sense that they overthink or overcomplicate a particular situation in their minds, or they exhibit an intellectual association with something that really doesn't belong in the situation in question. When terrible political decisions are made that are in retrospect completely, utterly stupid, one often finds, looking into them, that some highly sophisticated decision-making process was involved, and perhaps even a philosopher or two. So this is one of the premises that it is important to keep in mind. The second premise is that for human beings, there is a lot of what one could call a positive feedback loop that arises out of fairly inconspicuous circumstances at first. In a particular situation, if you're faced with one alternative or another, and it seems relatively minor to you, but you choose one of the alternatives, that can have a variety of effects cascading into the future. Effects that you do not foresee or do not anticipate, but nevertheless, effects that you choose and a path that you choose once you embark upon it. For instance, being in a particular location at a particular time, not just part of your general upbringing or your general environment, but you happen to step into a building and you happen to meet a certain individual. And that individual could become your friend for life or could become your enemy for life. And if you hadn't been there in that building at that time, this would not have occurred. And this individual and your interactions with this person could have changed your entire way of looking at the world or the direction in which you take your life. It's a simple enough situation. It happens to many people. Another possibility is you happen to come across a particular book or a particular resource on the internet, and you have been pondering a given set of ideas, and perhaps you've come at them with a particular worldview, but your worldview has been challenged in the past. But still, there's a critical mass of evidence that needs to accumulate before you change your worldview. And that visit to the internet or that particular book that you've encountered provides that linchpin on which you're able to change your view on this position. And very often, what you've chosen in the past certainly does contribute to your choices in the future. If you've chosen to pursue a given skill, for instance, and you are subsequently thinking about how to spend your time, are you going to continue to perfect that skill, or are you going to continue, or are you going to go off and pursue some other skill? Well, it's likely that you will be more motivated to perfect the skill that you started on before, if you're good at it and you enjoy it. On the other hand, a person might decide, well, it's time for something new, and by that decision, he might embark upon a new endeavor that would alter his skill set, perhaps develop him in a new direction. Maybe he will really like that new pursuit. And with a given person, just looking from the outside, just following some kind of simplified deterministic framework, it is impossible to say what that person will do. One could make an educated guess if one knows the person well enough, but in particular, it's very difficult to predict with any degree of accuracy if one is talking about human beings in general. In some ways, this discussion might seem a little bit scattered in the sense that I'm giving a lot of particular examples or anecdotes, if you will, but in some ways that even reinforces my point. My point is there's a great deal of diversity and individuality in human beings, and a particular theory of human development, if you will, doesn't capture all of that variation. What does capture a lot more of that variation is actually knowing people, and actually looking at people not as exemplars of humanity in general, but rather as individuals, and looking at what confluence of events and decisions brought an individual to where he or she is right now. What dilemmas has that individual faced in the past? Indeed, what influences has that individual had? I'm not negating the tremendous role that parents, teachers, peers, even influences from one's reading can have on a person's development. Nonetheless, a person's response to those influences is not uniform among all of humanity. And even for a particular person, it can be very flexible. Now, that's not to say that the environment cannot do a great deal of damage. For instance, parents who abuse their children, teachers who mistreat their students, peers who bully other peers, those can greatly inhibit a person's future potential. They can put roadblocks in the way of that person's pursuit of endeavors and opportunities that could have greatly improved that individual or could have opened up doors for him. And of course, a lot of this kind of abuse can be greatly demoralizing and even crippling to some people. As I've stated in my analysis of Amy Chua's controversial Wall Street Journal article, I don't believe that hardship or suffering build character in any way. Rather, to me, it appears that it's the people who had strong character to begin with who are able to endure hardship and suffering, whereas individuals with weaker character would have been broken by them. But that's not to say that character is something one has at birth. Indeed, it may well be that the way a person obtains strength of character during times of hardship and suffering is by trying to find positive influences to counteract the negative influences with which he is faced. Oftentimes, people who are pervasively bullied or abused, for instance, might find that their studies or some kind of other independent pursuit that doesn't require a lot of interaction with people form a kind of way out of that for them. If they can excel in something, then they can ultimately transcend the abuse in a way, get above the level of their abusers. Some people will take a more direct path and will try to simply rebel against the abusers and break free of the oppression. A great example of that is happening in Egypt right now, on which I hope to have more to say in a subsequent presentation. So there's a great deal of variation. I would like to address the subject of free will in greater depth, because there's a lot of confusion about what it means. Some people will set up a straw man by which they attempt to essentially demolish the position of free will altogether. And that straw man is that free will is unconstrained will. That essentially, if a person has true free will, then he can choose anything at any time, no matter what the situation is. And I don't think anybody seriously holds that kind of view. Clearly, a human being has constraints on him. A person who walks to the edge of a cliff might think it's a really neat idea to take off in flight. But clearly his biology doesn't permit him to just flap his arms and fly. If he has some specialized equipment, he might glide off the cliff, for instance, and he might enjoy that flight. But the situation in which he's faced will clearly limit what he's able to decide. And the limits can be external. For instance, the physical reality doesn't really permit him to engage in certain behaviors. Or there could be a severe societal or legal constraint. In many countries, expressing a certain opinion will lead one to be imprisoned, tortured, or executed. And people make decisions in that context. They could still decide to express that opinion, but chances are they won't want to, unless they believe that they have a reliable way to escape that punishment, or at least they're willing to take their chances if they're challenging an oppressive regime. So clearly there are constraints. And some of the constraints might be genetic. A person with Down syndrome probably isn't going to be able to say, well, I'm going to write a philosophical treatise now. Or I wish I could write a philosophical treatise now. Probably a person with Down syndrome wouldn't even have that kind of desire or aspiration. Perhaps for some individuals, past experiences, if they were particularly harsh, would break their character and lead them to adopt a fatalistic or defeatist attitude, which might result in certain kinds of ambitions being out of the question. All of this is conceivable, but nonetheless, in a particular situation, with all of the constraints that are placed on that situation, there is still a multitude of choices. So, for instance, if you have an individual who walks to the edge of a cliff, well, there are many things that individual could do. He could just stand and enjoy the view. Or he could say, I really wish I could fly. And so the next time I come to this cliff, I'm going to bring some equipment with me that will actually enable me to fly. Or that individual could say, I wish I could fly, but it's a silly idea, and I really have no time for silly ideas, so I'm going to turn around and walk back. And you can think of probably 100 other different responses to that situation. An individual facing an oppressive regime. Well, he might not want to lose his life right now, but something might be going through his mind about the oppression that he witnesses on a daily basis. It could be, well, life isn't so bad because I still have some kind of fortune in my life. I still have food, I still have a family, I still have a place to live, etc. Many people respond that way. Another response could be, well, I can't overtly rebel against this regime, but I could bide my time and wait and see what happens. And essentially, my moment to strike will be in the future. Or he could say, there are subtler ways to rebel that aren't quite prohibited, but might be pushing the boundary a little bit. In the former Soviet Union, for instance, that might have been listening to Western music or reading Western literature. As you can see, in the same environment, for the same individual, every situation brings about a kind of fork in the road. If you choose one branch, your life will turn out differently from if you choose another. And you can anticipate some of the consequences of those choices, but not nearly all of them. Indeed, you will be surprised where your life takes you, no matter who you are. I certainly have been surprised with mine. And to the extent that you can plan for the future, you have some control. Now, that being said, I don't mean to imply that a human being's future is also chaotic and unpredictable. Again, there is a degree of control. And there is, I believe, a series of approaches that could maximize human well-being in light of all of the uncertainties and constraints and limitations that we all face. There are certain decisions that increase one's exposure to risk and certain decisions that decrease it. There are certain decisions about how to allocate one's time. For instance, if you devote yourself to your health or your intellectual development, chances are you might still get hit by a bus tomorrow. Or chances are that all of your intellectual investment will still go unrecognized, and you might appreciate it, but other people wouldn't. You might be ahead of your time, for instance. But nonetheless, it is better to do these things than not to do them. It is better to do these things, not only because they increase your likelihood of getting a positive outcome, but also because the very pursuit of these activities ennobles and elevates the individual. They are what Aristotle would call a constitutive part of human well-being. Not only are they a means to an end, but they are also part of the end in itself, which is, as I would characterize it, human flourishing, a very broad concept, admittedly. So, with this understanding in mind, that you are not just whatever you were destined to be at birth, and you are not just whatever your environment imposes on you or makes out of you, whether that be good or bad, but rather you are an individual whose destiny is at least partially in your hands, and what you do on an everyday basis is not only something that can improve your condition, but something that is part of your condition. Your activities as a human being, if they are uplifting and ennobling and productive, make you a better human being, just in the fact of your pursuing them. And you can choose to pursue them at any time, subject, of course, to the situation in which you live. In some situations, you might have more time and more opportunity to pursue a broader range of activity. But even in a highly restricted situation, you can choose to uplift your condition. And there are many stories that really powerfully relate this. The stories of concentration camp sufferers who nonetheless managed to survive that terrible ordeal. Viktor Frankl was a famous 20th century psychologist and psychiatrist who interviewed many concentration camp survivors. And one thing that he observed is that the survivors predominantly were future-oriented. They were the ones who tried to derive whatever uplifting aspects there were to derive in the drudgery and oppression that they experienced, and ones that made plans for what their lives would be like after they were liberated. The ones that perished were the ones whose thoughts primarily focused on their past and how they came to be in this terrible situation. And essentially, the thought was that all of the best aspects of their lives were behind them. But if you focus on the future, on what you could become, on ways to achieve self-improvement through the use of reason and through the recognition that you as an individual can achieve great things, then you have a much greater chance of flourishing. And you will flourish while you do it too. So the nature and nurture debate, I think, needs to be transcended. While it's clear that genes and upbringing are important factors, sometimes they are even limiting factors to an extent, they are not deterministic factors. They do not control the fate of any given human being. You control your fate through your choices.